Today at the National Press Club, Universities Australia Chair Professor Carolyn Evans. She'll explain the state of Australia's university sector and outline the reforms needed to ensure universities can continue to deliver. Professor Carolyn Evans with today's National Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club and today's Westpac address. My name is Julie Hare. I'm a director here at the club and a freelance journalist specialising in higher education. Our guest today is Professor Carolyn Evans. Professor Evans is the Chair of Universities Australia, Vice-Chancellor of Griffith University and, as of October, Vice-Chancellor of the University of Melbourne. Congratulations on such an eminent appointment. The Melbourne gig will be a bit of a homecoming. Before heading to Brisbane, Carolyn spent 22 years rising through the ranks from Associate Professor to Deputy Vice-Chancellor. She's also an alumnus of the university before upping stumps and heading to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar and to complete a PhD. Carolyn is an internationally recognised expert on religious freedom, a subject on which she has written many books and journal articles and given many speeches. Today, Carolyn is not talking about religious freedom, but the state of Australian universities. Universities are the backbone of the economy. They deliver both the skilled graduates who go on to work in complex, essential and creative jobs, and they also produce the research that leads to groundbreaking knowledge and discovery that shapes our futures. At the same time, universities have been attracting some unwanted attention. Governance and leadership failures have made headlines. Inflamed debates over international students have fed into political fractiousness. AI is reshaping the future at such a warp speed, it is nigh impossible to get a line of sight on what will happen over the next 2, 5 or 10 years. And there's more. Exactly 1 year ago, Carolyn delivered a speech on this very stage in which she warned that the inherently unfair student tuition fees were taking a toll on enrolments, particularly among the poorest and most disadvantaged. During that speech, she offered an alternative to the unfair and contested job-ready graduate scheme that means a large proportion of students pay well over $50,000 to complete a basic degree in arts and humanities, even as we endure a cost of living and intergenerational wealth crisis. A year later, and job-ready graduates are still with us, and is still damning a generation of graduates to a lifetime of debt. I remind our members that the club will have a podcast of this on our website later today. Please welcome Professor Carolyn Evans.
Thank you, Julie. Can I pay my respects to the traditional owners of this beautiful land that we're lucky to be on today? And can I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues, many of whom are joining us today. They have played an absolutely transformational and much needed role in our higher education sector, and I'm very grateful for your presence. Thank you to everybody who's taken the time to join us. Can I particularly acknowledge Chancellors and fellow Vice-Chancellors, the Secretary and Deputy Secretary of the Department of Education, the Chief Commissioner, Commissioners and staff of the Australian Tertiary Education Commission, Commissioners and leadership of TEXA, the CEO and staff of the Australian Research Council, the President of the Academy of Social Sciences, members of the Diplomatic Corps, staff from ministerial and shadow ministerial offices, Universities Australia members, colleagues and friends. On a hot, humid February in 2019, I started as Vice-Chancellor of Griffith University. It was my first day. I didn't have a car, I didn't understand the public transport, and so I got a taxi from my hotel to the Gold Coast campus. And when I directed the taxi driver to the campus and said that I was starting a job there, his unexpected response was, so what do you know about glycomics? I pretended ignorance, and he spent the rest of the journey enthusiastically and actually quite accurately describing the work of our Institute for Glycomics, and in particular the important work they were doing on developing a vaccine for malaria. Now, I don't know about you, but I've had a lot of conversations with taxi drivers. That is not normally how they go. But this gentleman was one of the Rotary members who had been as great folk at Rotary do, fundraising for years to try and get this malaria vaccine off the ground. He felt both pride and a rightful sense of ownership of the research of his local university, and he was keen to share it with me. It was an auspicious start. And over the years, I've connected with so many people who feel the same about their university. Griffith graduates who've used their degrees to do everything from creating the hit series Bluey to reducing maternal and infant mortality rates in PNG, to becoming the first female Commissioner of Police for Queensland, to becoming the first Arab astronaut in space. And I've worked with colleagues who are engaged on clinical trials to cure spinal cord injury, who are working with mothers in prison to reduce recidivism rates and improve post-prison outcomes, who are working with First Nations entrepreneurs to help their businesses to thrive, and who are recording whale migrations, patterns and songs. Nearly 8 years later, as I finished my time at Griffith, that has been the constant. The joy and the privilege of engaging with bright, passionate students, staff, alumni, and connected community members. Indeed, that has been my experience since the day I gave up a career in the law to become a junior academic. And I've told you Griffith stories, but you could talk to any one of my colleagues from any one of the universities in this room, and they would have equally brilliant stories about their students, alumni, and community. Over the past 8 years, however, much else has changed, and not all of it for the better. Our staff are still innovative, talented. They care deeply about their teaching and their research. But many are under pressure to do more with less. They're uncertain about the future and fatigued by change. Our students are terrific. When I speak to the scholarship students in particular, I often go away feeling absolutely inspired. But many of them are under financial pressure, which makes studying and focusing on study harder. Too many are hungry. Some are homeless. They are worried about a future with more debt and less employment certainty as technology changes the workforce, and they have greater needs in terms of material needs, educational needs, and financial needs. The recent increases in students who will receive payments for their practical placements in healthcare is incredibly welcome, as was the first tranche of such payments. It will change lives. It will keep people in education who desperately need to be kept in education. And I want to thank the government for recognising that and acting upon it. But you will be unsurprised to hear that I think we still have more to do. We also have to be honest about the role that universities have played. Too many students have had experiences that have fallen well short of both the high standards that we set for ourselves and that the community reasonably expects for us. And we, as leaders of the sector, need to be accountable for that. Next week, we will be launching the 3rd National Student Survey. We'll be inviting all students to anonymously share their experiences of life on campus and, in particular, their experiences of sexual harm. As a sector, we will respond to those results with empathy, but even more importantly, with action. We are similarly working hard to respond to anti-Semitism, including the shocking stories that came out of the Royal Commission. Universities Australia, for example, has supported a very talented team from Monash who have gone around training senior leadership teams and student complaint teams in many of our universities. We have been working with the Special Envoy and with Jewish student groups on the change that is clearly needed. The Respect at University survey also told us that racism in our universities was not limited to anti-Semitism, and we are already working with TEXA and key community groups on Islamophobia, racism against First Nations Australia, and indeed all forms of racism. We are responding to these serious concerns with urgency, transparency, and accountability. Because we must take responsibility for our own institutional failures, for the issues that I've outlined and indeed for others. Our sector has to strive to do better in the future. We should also acknowledge, however, that many of the challenges of the past 8 years have been caused by forces external to universities, and indeed often external to this country. The rapid and visible development of AI, the slightly less rapid, slightly less visible development of AI-powered robotics, the many impacts on COVID, including on youth mental health, and divisive social issues, many of which are turbocharged by malign foreign actors. Both young people and older people in the workforce are now facing the world with some degree of trepidation. They're not sure what jobs will be safe in the future. Young people are not even sure that there will be jobs in the future, and we all know that the jobs that do persist will change in ways both foreseeable and unforeseeable. Now, there are plenty of people out there who will sell you a book or a podcast telling you with great certainty the world of work will look like this in 10 years, in 20 years. The honest, realistic answer to that is we don't know. What we do know is at present, university study has very strong outcomes. 3 years after completing an undergraduate degree, 91.7% of domestic graduates in the labour market are in full-time employment. Those with any type of post-school qualification, the employment rate is 80%. Those for no post-school qualification have an employment rate of only 58%. The ABS statistics from last year likewise tell us that employers with bachelor degrees earn a median of $300 a week more than those with Cert 3 or 4, and $700 a week more than employers without post-school qualifications. Now, don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean university is for everyone, or that everyone gets a better result going to university, or even that this might not change in the future. But we are sending our young people down a dangerous path when we begin opining that university is no longer good value, when the evidence to date simply does not support this. Now, there are two slightly different issues that opponents raise in this regard. One is, do young people actually need a degree at all? And the second is it good value for money? Now, as Julie noted, I've said it before, but I am going to keep saying it till it changes, but the question of value for money lies at least in part of the hands of Parliament. They are setting the prices and also the costs for the vast majority of Australian students. Now, as universities, we have a very important role to play in terms of value for money. We have to ensure the quality of our education is as good as it could be. And we're responding to the challenges and the opportunities of AI. We're supporting cohorts struggling more financially, educationally, mentally. We're engaging much more productively with industry and with TAFE. And we are increasingly being called on to provide educational opportunities for people at every stage of the life cycle. These things are hard, they're expensive, but they're important, and that is our obligation as universities. On the government side, their obligation is to ensure that university is not so expensive that many people who would benefit from a higher education are excluded for it in the way of costs. And that includes, in particular, people from low socioeconomic backgrounds, regional students and First Nations students. The previous government's job-ready graduates policy is recognised by all as failing in this important respect. What is perhaps not as well recognised is the need for proper funding of teaching that is fit for purpose in this new environment. It is easily forgotten that JRG not only placed more financial burden on students, but also took a large amount of resourcing out of universities. Round figures, $800 million a year. Now that's $800 million not being spent on innovative teaching, smaller classes, permanent roles for academic staff, support for smaller, more niche disciplines. It's $800 million that cannot be used to create AI-proof forms of assessment or build the expertise of teachers to use AI in creative and imaginative ways. JRG was a fiscal boon for government, but a financial burden for both students and for university staff. And both elements of the JRG, the increased student debt and the decimation of teaching funding, are in urgent need of reform. To the other more fundamental question as to whether university is worthwhile at all, even if reasonably priced, well, that's one that That's quite a challenge for universities, but one that we have to face. In an AI world where knowledge and analysis can be produced in a matter of minutes, is there a role still for university? The hard and uncomfortable questions to grapple with. But I am strongly of the view that education through universities remains absolutely critical for individual students and for our society. A deep education that teaches critical thinking, qualified analysis, an understanding of a whole body of knowledge rather than just little bits and fragments of it, which inculcates skills, which encourages questioning, that has both a fundamental value and a utilitarian one. The fundamental point, education, the seeking of knowledge, the desire to learn, to understand our world better, to push the boundaries of that knowledge out, that is inherent in what it is to be human. And that's something I think in Australia we too often overlook in our public policy debates. Now, I do want to recognise, though, that when people give up years of their lives and increasingly put themselves in debt, most are looking for pragmatic outcomes in terms of career opportunities and progression. But in my view, a university education is one of the best bets for providing this in a world where a narrow skill set might be great to get you a job for a couple of years and then might completely disappear in terms of its utility just a couple of years later. Education in almost any discipline should create deep skills transferable as the workplace changes over time. Now, I don't want to be naive enough to claim that every single university student has this type of experience, but I do want to say it's what we do and should aspire to, and our funding models should reflect that, reflect what quality teaching looks like in this new world, and not be stuck in an old world of chalk and talk lectures and tutorials. Recent National Teaching Award recipients show what teaching for this new world looks like. Monash's virtual school, which provides education students with real teaching experiences, supporting students struggling in countries like Ukraine and Myanmar. Simulation postgraduate psychology at Macquarie. They're using role-playing, simulated interviews with clients and psychological assessments before sending their students out into the real world. And RMIT's Bridges of Hope and Innocence initiative, which have students actively investigate the claims of people who have been convicted but claim they are innocent. This is what great, innovative, imaginative teaching looks like. This is the future of teaching. This is what employers want from us. But it's not cheap. Teaching, however, is only one part of what Australian universities offer to our society. If we want those who graduate from universities to have high-quality jobs to go into, there is still much work to do. We have to, as a country, innovate. We have to develop new intellectual property. We need to set up new companies that will have national, indeed global significance. We must look to the areas of sovereign risk and make sure that we have capability in them. Now, the good news, the wonderful news, is this. Australian universities punch far above our weight when it comes to the quality of research. In terms of quality, just one measure, the 2027 QS World University Rankings placed 9 Australian universities in the top 100 in the world and 27 in the top 500 universities in the world. Now, focused as we are on ourselves, it's easy to forget our population is 1/3 of 1% of the world's population, and we have 9% of the universities in the top global 100. How extraordinary. That's something to celebrate, but not just to get an elephant stamp or a blue ribbon, not just because of international prestige, it's because it reflects the fact that our universities are among Australia's greatest concentrations of knowledge, research capability and talent. They educate people who are going to build the industries of the future. They undertake fundamental research on which future technologies depend, and they, at their best, bring together government, industry and community to create new solutions to old pressing problems. Now, much of that work may never result in a company or business, nor does it need to in order to be worthwhile. Its value might be seen in better public policy, better health outcomes, stronger communities, or just exciting new knowledge that opens doors we don't even understand where those doors will lead to yet. But spin-outs do provide one tangible measure of what can happen when university research moves beyond the campus and into the economy. The latest survey of public research commercialisation records 422 active spin-outs across Australian publicly funded research organisations, including but not limited to universities. In 2024 alone, those organisations created 89 new companies, earned $241 million in commercialisation income, and over $1 billion in industry research contracts. And universities are absolutely at the heart of that story. I could give you dozens of examples. Let me just touch on a few. HiStarter. It was spun out of the University of Wollongong to commercialise a breakthrough high-efficiency green hydrogen electrolyser. MGA Thermal emerged from the University of Newcastle and is developing scalable thermal energy storage. Q-Control grew out of fundamental physics research at the University of Sydney. And Synchron, spun out of the University of Melbourne, has been perfecting a stent implant that will allow people with severe paralysis to be able to communicate. Now, those companies are not isolated success stories. They are examples of a much larger national asset, a university system that generates ideas, develops talent, solves problems, and creates new economic opportunities for Australia. The ambitious Australia report, and I note some of the authors are here today, they applauded, quite rightly applauded, what had been achieved, but they sent a stark warning. More is needed. Again, I want to recognise and thank the government for some of the moves that they have made in this direction, in particular the incredibly welcome move to apply for membership of Horizon Europe. That is such a smart move on so many different dimensions. But you'll be unsurprised again to hear me say more work remains outstanding. We are at the moment neglecting some of the fundamentals. We need to make sure there is the right level of funding that goes into fundamental theoretical research, without which we have nothing to translate. We have to make sure that we are investing in scalable and significant national infrastructure needs in research. And those infrastructures can be useful for both the public and the private sector in creating the industries of the future. And with the abolition of the Australian Economic Accelerator, we need to ask, what is the plan for moving that intellectual property from universities into impact on people's lives? Now, as a social scientist, you would expect me to say, of course, innovation doesn't just apply to products and new intellectual property. It applies to social, economic, political and cultural change. And again, much for Australia to be proud of in this regard. We're one of the world's oldest continuous democracies. In 1984, South Australia became the first place in the world to give women both the right to vote and to stand for Parliament. The Australian version of the secret ballot, introduced in 1856, was adopted around the world. They called it the Australian ballot. And there's been plenty of social and economic innovation as well, from the Harvester Judgment's fair and reasonable wage principle to the current world-leading national ban on social media for people under the age of 16. And so our current day social scientists and humanities scholars are critical to facing the challenges of these times, when faith in democracy and institutions is under ever increasing threat, and we need new solutions to old problems. For the world is indeed moving quickly, and universities need to play new roles in helping to rise to the challenge. And this brings me to my final point. What are the policy and cultural settings that are required to ensure that universities can be at their best doing the things that we do for Australian society? And I want to focus on two issues. First is improving the quality of the public debate, and the second is protecting university autonomy. Look, to the first one, having better and more serious public policy debates. As a society, we need to have the democratic maturity to look at the full consequences of policy decisions and not just become distracted by the theatric of politics. The most pressing example here for our sector, but by no means the only one, is international students as an element of migration policy. Now, I want to be fair. There are some good reasons for wanting to reduce the number of international students and of migrants. But we do need an honest and informed policy debate about the consequences. Over decades, both sides of politics have reduced public funding to universities, putting some of the cost onto domestic students, but capping that cost and leaving a really quite significant gap in university budgets. And so our public policy sent universities out into the world to find additional funding where we could. And we had to do that. The sort of gaps that we're filling are things like cross-subsidising expensive teaching for Australian students, cross-subsidising small disciplines that are important for the national interest but that might not stand up on their own, covering the full cost of publicly funded research, investing in critical infrastructure. That includes research kit, that includes buildings, but increasingly it's digital infrastructure, which is going to be really important for the future. And of course, we have to cover the ever increasing costs of compliance. Now, I think a lot of Australian public think, oh, you're public universities. You must be funded for all of those things. We're not. Government doesn't pay for any of them, and they haven't shown any interest in doing so. Sent out into the world to find a way of filling that gap, generating income from international students was the only realistic, scalable solution. Now, a lot of public discourse likes to say, oh, that's universities being greedy, risky, addicted to international student funding. In truth, we were forced by government policy to be reliant upon it. The Australian taxpayer got a world-class university system at a cut price, and Treasury and the taxpaying public have got the benefit. With the egregious raises in the cost of student visas and post-study work right visas, the government too is becoming a bit reliant on international student income at the same time that they tell us that that's a problem for our sector. So you can promote as a political party a policy that says we're going to radically cut international student numbers and we're going to do it very quickly, very urgently. But what is the plan for the financial sustainability of our universities? Will taxpayers resume the burden of paying for public institutions? Will we happily as a nation see thousands, maybe tens of thousands more job losses and the closure of campuses, often smaller and regional campuses? And while we're asking those questions, we might ask, what's the plan for areas like health and aged care, which are very reliant on international students and recent international graduates? And what are the consequences for our tourism industry, which has substantial benefit from family and friends visiting international students in Australia? What are the long-term diplomatic consequences if young people in the Asian region decide to go to China for their education rather than to come for Australia? And frankly, what is the plan for economic growth if we're disinvesting in migration, education, and innovation? Now, at the end of all that analysis, a political party might still want to deeply cut international student numbers, and they might have really good reasons for doing so. But at least people will be eyes wide open that in addition to the wonderful things that they have been promised, there are negative consequences as well. You never know. The politicians making those claims might even start thinking through how they would deal with those consequences. The second set of changes that I would like to see is the creation of both legislative settings and a broader culture publicly, which ensures that universities have sufficient independence and autonomy. Now, I know, at first blush, this sounds pretty self-interested, like a form of special pleading. It's not. The idea of university autonomy has both individual and an institutional element. For the individual, it is the collective manifestation of the right of the academic freedom of students and staff. But actually having universities autonomously is an inherent good, a critical protection against creeping authoritarianism and populist pressure. A thriving liberal democracy requires a range of strong, independent institutions to stand between the significant power of the state and the relative powerlessness of the individual. Unions and business organisations, media, religious institutions, and, for centuries, universities. It is no coincidence that authoritarian turns by government through global history and today almost always target the independence of universities early. We cannot take our democracy for granted, and we must protect the role that universities play in that democracy. Now, this position around university autonomy was powerfully articulated by former Prime Minister John Curtin when he said, "Above all, university must be a citadel for freedom, for intellectual, social and moral freedom. No matter what handcuffs or prisons other institutions may find necessary, the seat of learning must be a bulwark for liberty. What may be expedient for the state may well be a menace for mankind." So today I am calling on the government to consider legislative protection for university autonomy, to make clear what it is that governments cannot and should not do to help stem the tide of increasing government overreach. When governments threaten to regulate our media, the democratic threat is recognised. Questions are asked, they're debated, they should be. But the same isn't true for our universities. Every time that government begins to regulate or indeed informally push universities to particular directions, they do so for good reasons. They don't do so out of malice. Indeed, many inside universities and university unions, misguidedly in my opinion, encourage them to get on, do more. But creeping regulation over years, the creation of new federal bureaucracies, the populist backlashes from the left and the right when they don't like something we do, all this is creating an ever narrower space for freedom of both institutions and individual faculty and students. Now, let me be clear. If you give Australia's 40-odd universities freedom, some will make mistakes. Well, let's be honest. Every single one of them will make mistakes, get something wrong, try something that fails, predict a future need and make that in an inaccurate way. And the immediate solution to some, more government intervention. But some universities will try something innovative that succeeds beyond all expectations. Some will rightly spot a coming employment need that everybody else misses and cater to it. Some will pioneer new forms of teaching, of research, of intellectual breakthroughs. However, if you try to control too much from the centre and the government, dare I say ATEC, gets it wrong, then every single university will make the same mistake. Let me take an example. It seems perfectly reasonable, absolutely sensible to say we should direct more of our resources to disciplines where the jobs of the future are going to be. And governments will decide what those are and require universities to focus on those areas. Trouble is that humans generally, businesses a bit strangely, and governments emphatically are not actually very good at predicting the future needs of the workforce, even in much less turbulent times than this. It wasn't so long ago that we were all being told we need more and more graduates from every discipline who can code. Coding is an essential skill. Well, quite different IT skills are now much more urgently required. I'm hearing from tech company CEOs that they're looking for graduates with backgrounds in the humanities and creative arts because they want to bring that lateral creative thinking to the table. And some of the more manual jobs that our young people are being pressured to go into on the basis that they'll last forever, well, maybe in a few years down the track they will be replaced by robotics. Can a central planning authority ever work at the pace required with the certainty needed to meet this task? History tells us no, and the pace of change is far, far faster than it has been historically. Now, no institution will get this 100% right, but we are better off trusting that the University of New England, deeply embedded in the communities around Armidale, will have a better sense of the education and research that will benefit that region than even the most enlightened Canberra body. And don't get me wrong, there is a place for regulation, for accountability, and for reasonable debate at where the limits of university autonomy end and how accountability for public money is overlaid. My fear is at present, there's no debate at all. Just an endless sense that whatever regulation is seen as expedient can be introduced and will not prove a menace. I'm coming to the end of my time at one wonderful university, and I'm feeling really excited about going on to another absolutely brilliant university. I remain proud of this sector. I want to see it thrive. I want to see our universities be diverse, inclusive, innovative, and look forward to the future. I want them to be anchored in the best of the past, but bold and curious about what we might bring in years to come. Much of the onus for achieving that is on us in the sector. We have to strive every day to do better, to recognise our shortcomings, and to prepare for a really complex future. But it is a shared responsibility with government, with industry, with community, and to be frank, universities are not the only ones who have room for both reflection and improvement. Having quoted Labor luminary John Curtin earlier, let me finish with Robert Menzies, who quadrupled federal funding for universities. Universities are not to be regarded as a home of privilege for the few, but as something essential for millions of people who may never enter their doors. We must become a more and more educated democracy if we are to raise our spiritual, intellectual, and material living standards. Both Curtin and Menzies lived through terrible times. They saw the worst of humankind on stark global display, and they both understood universities are essential institutions for protecting strong democracies and creating thriving societies. I started today with a story about a taxi ride of a driver who felt pride in the work of his local university and a sense of ownership in what it is achieving. With so much public focus at the moment on all that is problematic in universities and so little on the huge number of things that are great, maybe I'd have a different conversation with him today. But what we must all work towards, universities, government, community, our broader society, will not be easy, but it will be important, is to work towards a society where, probably not on my first day as Vice-Chancellor of the University of Melbourne, but certainly in the years ahead. Conversations about universities will not be dominated by stories of controversy or failure, but by the lives they change, the discoveries they create, the communities they strengthen, and the extraordinary, glorious possibilities that they open. Thank you.
Well, that was a rousing applause. Hate to, kind of hurt the vibe, but here we go. There have been a number of very high-profile cases of leadership and governance failures in universities in recent times. Do you agree there is a crisis in governance and leadership in universities? If not, why not? And if so, why has it emerged at this point in history?
I think there have been problems in some universities, absolutely. I do not think there is a generalised crisis in governance in Australian universities. And I do think that the term governance is starting to be used in quite a wide sweeping way. And I'm going to give a slightly long answer to your question, but it's a really important question. So there have been failures of governance. There have been people underpaid, there have been conflicts of interest, there have been allegations of bullying which have been proved. They're unacceptable. They're unacceptable in any sector, in any industry. They occur in most sectors and industries, and they need to be dealt with. And on the whole, they are and can be dealt with by existing mechanisms. So, where we've failed on that, we need to look at that pretty hard, and we have tried as a sector to do so. Second set of things that sometimes swept into a notion of governance failures is disagreements about what governance looks like in a university. how many staff members you have, how many student members you have. That's not a governance failure, that's an intellectual disagreement about what university should look like in terms of its governance. There is a reason that universities moved away historically from such strong representation that was internal and started to say actually the people on our governance bodies should represent the broader community and the range of skills and ideas in that community so that universities didn't become too insular. Now, you can have a reasonable debate about that, you can disagree about it, but that's not inherently a governance failure. The third thing that tends to get swept up here is that universities have not been able to solve all of the really difficult social problems that no level of government, no institution, no sector has been able to resolve. We have had instances of gender-based violence. That's not good enough. We've had racism and issues and problems there. We've had anti-Semitism. It would be, but you can look around, it's very hard to see any other institution or sector that has worked as hard to deal with those problems as we have. And certainly, they're ones that it's very difficult to say that just because you haven't dealt with them as some people would like, that constitutes a failure. The final, and the thing that really troubles me, is that what would generally be considered good governance in most ordinary understandings of good governance is now beginning to be held against universities as a sign of poor governance. And in particular, it is pretty governance 101 to say that when revenue goes backwards, you have to do something to cut costs. And yet that sort of fundamental basic principle of good governance in the normal world is starting to be held against universities as an example of bad governance, as long as there's enough disruption and noise about it. That troubles me deeply. And I think that when you throw all of those things together, it creates the impression, oh, there's lots of problems with governance. Actually, there are a small number of serious problems with governance, and many of those are going to be addressed by the new standards on governance. And then there's a much more complicated range of issues.
Okay, thank you. Our first question goes to Dan Holmes from the Mandarin.
Thank you very much, Professor. I wanted to pivot a little bit onto funding arrangements, if that suits you. I've been watching the Universities Accord inquiry with interest, and as you've said, more or less everybody is agreeing that at least that $800 million a year in university funding needs to be restored in order for the transition to managed growth to work effectively. One of the bigger disagreements that we've seen is what the correct balance between student choice and system stability is. I just wanted to invite you to sort of talk through that a little bit from Universities Australia's perspective.
Thank you. So the current legislation before Parliament has two major elements. One is needs-based funding, and that is a recognition that it costs more to teach students from educationally, economically disadvantaged backgrounds from the regions and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. And I think there is a good deal of agreement across the sector that that's important and welcome. There are some disagreements about exactly how we should deal with regional students, but I think the recognition that you need additional funding to give a good education to those students is something that we're all agreed on. The second element is creating more of a system and less of a free market in higher education. Now, when I talked about university autonomy, I did want to recognise that when government is funding a limited number of places, and even in my wildest dreams, we're not expecting that they're going to be able to fund an unlimited number of places, it has some legitimate role in determining how those places might be distributed. This current legislation absolutely does reduce student choice. I think we shouldn't shy away from that. But, as you rightly say, it does so in the name of student stability or system stability, and that's important too. Now, there are other ways you could achieve the same outcome. While it's often fun to pit the group of 8 against regional universities, what have you, when I've talked to our members, including the leaders of large metropolitan universities, every single one of them has said we must protect our regional universities. We must find ways to make sure that they continue to play the absolutely critical role in the regions that they play, and that the current system doesn't do that properly. There is, of course, room for debate about what the best way to do that is. This legislation is one of the ways the government is trying to use to do that. I think we're going to have to wait to see whether that works or doesn't work. But of course, you're going to expect a little bit of tension between members on that point.
Thank you very much.
Our next question is from John Ross from Times Higher Education.
Hi, Professor Evans. I'd like to take you back to your speech. So you're saying the institutional autonomy of Australian universities needs better legal protection. So just last week, Australia strengthened a law, it's called the Foreign Relations Act, which requires universities to notify the government about agreements they have in countries where universities are deemed to lack institutional autonomy because the governments have too much control over their activities, so that our Foreign Affairs Minister can decide whether those agreements need to be scrapped. So if that institutional autonomy test was applied domestically, would Australia pass?
That's a fair question, John, and it was one asked even about the law in its original manifestation. Craig Fowler has done some really interesting work using the European University Autonomy Scale, which is a recognised global scale for looking at university autonomy, and has tracked over the last couple of years and what will happen with legislation if it passes over the next couple of years. Australia sort of slipping out of the group, being Canada, the UK, the US, pretty brilliant countries when it comes to universities, and moving down more towards countries like China, Singapore, Japan. Actually also brilliant countries when it comes to higher education, but countries where vast investment of money by the government sits alongside greater control of what universities do. So yeah, I think there'd be a pretty fair question to ask about the autonomy of our universities there. And that Act itself is probably an example of where if we had better protection of university autonomy, there might have been some more questions asked. We are all very serious about national security, right? We want to do the right thing on national security, no questions asked about that. That is absolutely important, and this is why government and universities put together the Universities Foreign Interference Task Force. We want to renew and refresh that and make sure it does a good job. We are more concerned, though, about pretty nebulous concepts like national interest. Who gets to define what the national interest is? Does it change from minister to minister, from government to government? Does it depend on what was on the front pages of the paper the day before? That is much more troubling when it comes to university autonomy, and it is what it is in terms of legislation, but I think it's another example of the general point that I was making.
Our next question is Courtney Withers from the ABC.
Thank you very much for your address, just on autonomy as well. At a time when AI is turning the university sector upside down, is it time for a rethink and for the development of national strategy in terms of AI use in universities? And if not, why not?
Yeah, no, it's not. It is time to consider nationally what our strategy for AI is, and that universities will play a role, and this is what, for example, Singapore has done. But again, at a time when things are so turbulent and so disruptive, the idea of central authority simply deciding at a moment in time, and it's very difficult to change these things at government, even when the times change with them. You know, this is how universities would deal with these issues. I think that would be madness. I think we need to trust the fact that our universities have a lot of experts in AI, have a lot of experts in teaching and assessment, and they are doing some good work and sharing the knowledge between one another. We do talk to each other, we share best practice. That is a much better way of going than trying to have some bureaucratic, centralised approach to the issue.
Thank you.
Thank you. And next question is from Andrew Green of The Nightly.
Professor Evans, Andrew Green from The Nightly. I'm also a failed law student at the University of Canberra, but somehow an adjunct professor at the same institution. Just wanted to get the declaration out. I wanted to turn to the question of research agreements, particularly with the People's Republic of China. We've seen the Foreign Minister cancel a few of those recently, and some growing concerns in the United States about research collaboration between universities in that country, but also in Australia with the Chinese state and possibly with the PLA. Do you think there is a need for a broader rethink in Australia? Do you think that these debates are getting too out of control and that it's perhaps affecting genuine scientific research?
Well, first of all, I think we should not outsource our foreign policy to the United States, ever, and now in particular. Second, I want to acknowledge that the Minister for Foreign Affairs will have access to information that we don't necessarily have. And we do have to accept that, and sometimes they will know more than we do. But we do need to be careful. Again, this is about thinking about both sides of the story. We have to be careful about national security. We have to be thoughtful on that, in that respect. But we do also have to understand we are a tiny fraction of the world's population. We produce about 3% of the world's research, which means 97% of the world's research is produced elsewhere. There's a bit of a mentality in Australia to think about research in China as though it's very substandard, just waiting to steal intellectual property from Australia. China invests in research infrastructure and research capability and outstanding scientists at a rate that would absolutely shock most Australians. If we work with them, we actually get often to be involved in some of the very best research in the country, and we create new intellectual property that potentially neither side could have produced by itself. And so I'm going to come back to the University's Foreign Interference Task Force, UFIT, as the way that we try and square that circle. I was around when UFIT was started. We had some really productive discussions with the intelligence services. Well, we learned some things by doing that. There are things that sometimes universities can be naive about. They learned a few things too. And that helped us to work through both the risks of failing to engage and the risks of engaging. So rather than coming out with some blanket statement, we should never research with China, we should always research with China, we need to have these bodies that bring together all of the relevant bits of government, all of the relevant leaders in the sector, and make a much more sophisticated set of decisions. And Universities Australia are certainly looking for a revamp of UFIT to be better able to do that.
But do you acknowledge there has been some naivety, as you've mentioned just now, in the recent past where some researchers perhaps compromised our own military?
So look, 10 years ago, I think as a sector, there were some fair criticisms to be made. I don't think we have a sector-wide problem anymore. Can we account for the actions of every single individual researcher? No. And, there have been a couple of researchers who've probably done things that are a little bit silly. But does that create a national emergency that needs dealing with in some significant or substantive way? No. I'm going to say it again. I think UFIT is a really sensible body to deal with this, and universities are doing far more now, to track foreign relationships, research and agreements than they ever have in the past.
Our next question is from Marnie True from the AFR.
Thank you for your address, Professor. I want to return to artificial intelligence. You used your speech to make a case for the enduring value of university education, even as this technology kind of upends a lot of what we think about when we think about education. You spoke specifically about the value of critical thinking skills and deep analysis and those sort of things. Obviously, if they're to be maintained, it's going to require, I guess, universities upholding rigorous academic standards, assessment standards. So my question is kind of twofold. First of all, do you think that universities are doing enough in that space now? Have they acted quickly enough? And secondly, when you take up your new role, congratulations, by the way, what are some of the specific measures you plan to implement to make sure that, I guess, AI use amongst students is moderated?
Thank you. So the Tertiary Education Quality Standards Authority has been working very closely with universities around ensuring sufficient rigour in our assessment. Different universities have chosen different pathways to do that. Melbourne University, I have to say, at the moment looks to me from the outside like it's been pretty rigorous, with half of the assessment in all of the subjects requiring some sort of AI-proof assessment. That might be oral presentation, it might be written exams and so forth. But other universities have other ways of doing things. If I think about my current university, we have a lot of mature age students, a lot of parent students, a lot of students who are required to be online. It would be very difficult for us to use the same sort of approaches to this as the University of Melbourne. So, we've been continuing as a sector to work this through with TEXA. It'll never be perfect, and as soon as it is perfect, AI will change and it will become imperfect again. But I think that is the appropriate way to deal with these issues.
And if I may, you mentioned oral assessments, and I think that's a really interesting idea. Are there other ideas being thrown around of how to kind of rethink what an assessment is?
Absolutely. And look, this was all happening before AI. In some ways, many of the people who are excited, interested and involved in assessment have been saying this is great because it's an excuse for us to now make sure that we push forward on more authentic forms of assessment. And again, it depends on the subjects. The students in my conservatorium or the musical theatre students, like, they're playing their instruments, they're singing their songs. There's nothing much that AI can do to help them with that. But many of our health discipline subjects have a lot of hands-on assessment that might be in hospitals and healthcare. It might be in simulated environments, which we're getting much better at. AI actually has created some really interesting opportunities with creating even more sophisticated simulated environments for people. We've got clinical programs in law, in tax, in all sorts of areas. So there are lots of opportunities to assess students in a way that's not just a take-home written assessment. Although I have to say, as somebody who's been a long-term law lecturer, I would like to see a way that we can also save the deep thinking and analysis that is part of writing a long essay. I actually think that is a valuable skill. It's sort of push-ups for the brain. Even if you don't ever write a long essay again, it's got those muscles working. And one of the big social issues we'll have to face with AI is this level of cognitive risk or cognitive degrading. We actually need to find ways of ensuring people don't outsource our capacity to think to the machine, and universities will have to be a serious and important part of that.
Thank you very much.
Simon Gross from Canberra IQ.
Thank you. My question comes off evidence from the current Uni Melbourne VC to the Anti-Semitism Royal Commission. He was being asked about responses to the occupation of an admin building, an academics office and the encampment, the protest encampment. And he explained that Uni Mel's brought in new rules. So that they can remove outsiders, people who aren't staff or students, from campus. They've banned camping on campus, and they've made it a rule that any protest has to be outside the buildings, not inside. As the incoming VC of Uni Melb, are you content with these rules? Do you see more to be done? And as UA Chair, do you think that all universities should adopt this kind of regime?
Yes, so again, I'm going to refer you back to my speech. I'm not so keen on the all universities should have to adopt approach. We've had universities that have had no protests, no encampments, no occupation. That's probably actually the majority of Australian universities. They simply may not need to do so at this point in time, though I know, my university would be, my current university would be in that position. We've certainly looked at lessons to be learned. Look, I think the University of Melbourne, in a very difficult situation, has tried to balance the rights of freedom of speech and free protest with ensuring the safety and lack of harassment of members of the University of Melbourne Committee. Now, as somebody who works in human rights, I'd say on the whole, changes to free speech that focus on what we'd sometimes call manner and form, where you can protest and so forth, they are much easier to justify than things that target particular types of speech. So I think Melbourne has tried to focus on those issues. You can still protest, but you can't necessarily do that inside buildings, disrupting other people's work. You can still have your views on a whole range of things, but you're not necessarily going to be able to encamp on the property overnight. It seems like a pretty sensible balance to me, but I'm happy to look at that when I get there in a bit more detail.
Thank you.
Our next question is Noah Seckham from AAP.
Thanks, Professor, for your speech today. One of the things you touched on is that trying to incentivise which degrees students take up is a pretty flawed model that we can't predict the future, and we've failed to so far. You did say, though, that humanities degrees and spaces where people are encouraged to think are becoming sought after, even in tech spaces. So what is the way to make, how do we incentivise, ultimately, students to broader degrees, perhaps? How do we change the funding model? What do we do?
I actually don't think we should be in the business of incentivising students to make determinations about what they are going to study because they're passionate about it, because they love it, or what they're indeed going to do with their life in terms of professions. What we've got to do is stop disincentivising them. And job-ready graduates creates a huge disincentive, particularly for people in the disciplines like the humanities. So I would prefer to take that hurdle away, and then if students choose to study arts, they choose to study arts. If they choose not to, that's absolutely fine too. And if workforces see the need for people with those degrees and qualifications, they should absolutely let students know that and understand that and counter some of the negative publicity that's out there in the world.
Thank you.
Don't you think it should be easier for students to be able to study across a range of disciplines and a range of subjects? So do arts and physics and music, and just follow. A lot of degrees make it very difficult for that to happen.
Yeah, they do, and there's actually good reason for that in the case of many degrees. Many people studying in Australia are studying professionally accredited degrees to become nurses, to become engineers, to become lawyers, and the professional accreditation does require limitations on that. And look, what you're talking about here, though, more generally is the toss-up between a liberal arts degree with a wide variety of different sorts of things that people can study and becoming more focused. Australia's actually a bit in the middle in global terms. You know, when I used to teach at Oxford, people would study history or they would study physics very narrowly. At least here they tend to study sciences or humanities. And again, some universities offer great double degrees where people can do these things, or multiple majors. Others have chosen to be more focused. Let's give students a variety of options in a diverse sector.
Okay. Corrie McLeod from Innovation Oz.
Thank you very much for your address, Professor. I have a question about AI, but more around the commercials. Yep. The data centre principles were released earlier this year, and number 5 talks about favourable access or favourable for research and innovation. Now, with the mainstream use within universities of the amount of AI consumption that's happening, there's 2 questions. One, do you have thoughts on that particular principle and any detail that you might be aware of? And secondly, how are universities sort of how to future-proof the costs on AI consumption when it is quite unknowable, at least right now?
Well, show me anyone who knows how to future-proof the cost on AI, and we'll happily learn a lesson from them, because it is one of the big challenges, that things are comparatively cheap at the moment, but they're getting more expensive, and doubtless once it's fully integrated into all our systems, it will get a lot more expensive again. That's certainly what history would tell us. I think it's really important that when we're thinking about our national strategy for AI, we do, as you say, have principles that prioritise the use of that AI for life-changing research. The opportunities to accelerate drug development, for example, to create treatments and therapies that will be much more specific to specific groups of people. There is enormous potential there, and that is an opportunity, I think, both for the private sector and the public sector to come together for the benefit of Australians. And when the government's thinking about the principles they have, I respect and I'm glad to hear that they have focused on that opportunity.
Thank you.
Michael De Percy from Spectator Oz.
Thank you. You spoke about academic freedom and value for money, but I want to ask about Universities Australia and its advancement of identity politics across the sector. And with taxpayers contributing over $21 billion annually, how does this partisan agenda represent value for money?
Well, thank you for that thoughtful and considered question. Look, I don't think Universities Australia is in the business of advancing identity politics. Universities Australia has taken very seriously the fact that there are groups of people who've been excluded from our universities, in particular First Nations people, and that was something where Australia was well beyond even other Commonwealth countries, even other members of the British Empire. There was a long period of time when Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples had been excluded from our universities, and we are unapologetic about the fact that we are working with our First Nations colleagues to try and make sure universities are places where First Nations people can thrive. And we will always look at the experience of those in our universities, as we saw at the Respected Universities Survey, who have been harmed by the actions of universities, and try and limit that harm. I don't see that as being the same as identity politics.
Our final question is from Nick Stewart from Ability News.
I was going to ask who paid for the cab charge on that long trip to the Gold Coast, but instead, how about Chinese students here in Australia? How welcome do you think they feel in the current situation?
So we saw, I thought, some really shocking racism against Chinese Australian students during COVID. And I think it is an example of why when we think about racism, we need to think about principles that apply to different groups of people over different periods of time. My experience with our Chinese students now is I think they're feeling much more welcome, which is a great thing. But that's something that we always need to keep a pretty close eye on. And I pay for my own taxi. Just let the record show.
Okay, please join me in thanking Professor Carolyn Evans.